It's about 10 p.m., October 1st, 1847. The Mitchell family is living in the Pacific Bank at the top of Nantucket's Main Street. There's a party of invited guests mingling, laughing, sharing stories with the well-respected Nantucket family. But 29-year-old Mariah Mitchell had no interest in the banalities of the social affair, so she quietly excuses herself, grabs a lantern, and heads upstairs to the rooftop observatory. But almost as soon as she left, she quickly returned, found her father, pulled him aside, saying, "I think I just found a comet." And without hesitation, William Mitchell hurried up the stairs and almost immediately agreed with Mariah. But, with her usual caution and prudence, she asked him to wait until they were positive. But sure enough, Mariah had just discovered a comet. Not only was she the first one to lay eyes on the celestial body, but this comet would be named after her, and it would launch her to an illustrious career and international acclaim.
I'm Annalie Gilbert Keith, and I'm joined by Thomas Parrish.
Hey,
and Adam DeLogue.
Hello.
We are members of the Visitor Operations team at the Nantucket Historical Association. In each episode, one of us will go on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then we'll invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. This month, we'll be discussing famed Nantucketer Mariah Mitchell, who, under the tutelage of her father, became a successful and famous astronomer following the discovery of a comet from the view on her Nantucket roof. I am very excited for today's episode. When I was 8, I wanted to do a research project about Mariah Mitchell, and my teacher said there wasn't enough information about her.
That's just not true at all.
So let's talk about Mariah Mitchell.
Let's do it.
Thomas, how common would it have been for someone on Nantucket to be studying the stars?
Actually, pretty common. Mariah Mitchell is born in 1818, which means that she really grows up when whaling is the dominant industry of Nantucket. And the stars are life-saving tools. Understanding the heavens is your way of navigating from Nantucket around the world to the Pacific and making it home. Knowing the stars or not could be the difference of a voyage returning to Nantucket or being stuck out in the Pacific. And there were many people on Nantucket, both men and women, who studied the stars for exactly that purpose of getting these ships back home.
So, not to spoil anything here, but Mariah Mitchell was not a whaler. Why was she studying the stars?
Well, her father was an astronomer. He was one of, if not the leading astronomer of the island. One of the things he actually would do is use astronomical observations to rate navigational tools to make sure that they were accurate and that they would bring these sailors back home. That's how he made some of his money.
I feel like nowadays we don't necessarily put so much stock in the top astronomer on the island. You know?
Maybe not on the island.
But back in the day, I feel like, you're saying that this would have been a pretty important task.
It was. I mean, it was very complicated, not impossible to learn, but very complicated math and science. And doing it correctly, again, is dramatic, but not an over-exaggeration. Doing it correctly was the difference between life or death, right? If you miscalculate, it could potentially lead someone to being lost at sea. And so it takes a lot of precision to do this math correctly, to get accurate readings, to make sure that these navigational tools could get you home.
Thomas, you said Mariah's father was rating navigational tools for whalers. What exactly was he calibrating, and why did that have to happen on Nantucket?
So they're calibrating a tool called a chronometer. And a chronometer is basically just a clock, but it works at sea. It's a very precise clock. And as you travel around the world, you can compare the time of this clock to what's called Nantucket time and local time. And so it's calibrated using astronomical observations to the time on Nantucket very precisely. And anywhere on the world you're traveling, you can calculate solar noon and compare to when it is on Nantucket time. So let's say solar noon's at 12, the chronometer reads 6 o'clock. That means that you are 6 hours behind Nantucket time, which means that you are a quarter of the day, a quarter of the way around the world, you are 90 degrees west of Nantucket. And this can give you a location up to about a mile or so anywhere on the globe. You're essentially calculating a very precise and local time difference.
So it gives you a very precise longitude.
Longitude, yes. It's only calculating east to west, but it's always in comparison to something, and you pick that moment. Often it was Nantucket for whalers, and you were calculating your location relative to Nantucket.
So if William Mitchell was doing that work out of their house, how did that impact Mariah's life?
She grew up doing astronomical observations with her father. And I mean, her first one was at 12 and a half years old when she helped her father measure the duration of a solar eclipse. And so even at 12 and a half years old, she's actually doing astronomy. And it is in a large part to get these very precise astronomical observations and calculations to make the calibrations that much more accurate.
You just don't see 12-and-a-half-year-olds doing astronomy these days.
No, and I one up you. When she was 14 years old, she calibrated her first chronometer. This whale captain comes to the Mitchell household. They asked for William Mitchell, who, according to Mariah's brother, was calibrating all the chronometers of the 90-ship whale fleet on Nantucket. And the captain was leaving in about 2 days, and he needed it calibrated now. And Mariah said, I can't do that. And the captain says, I need to leave now. And Mariah said, okay, I've seen it do before. I know how to do it conceptually. And so at 14 years old, she calibrates her first chronometer. Now just think about the trust that this captain is putting into a 14-year-old Nantucketer, right? Like, he's quite literally trusting his life to a 14-year-old doing very precise calculations that he's now going to use to travel into the Pacific with.
It's amazing. You wouldn't want to trust 14-year-old Annalie with math like that. Absolutely not.
And 24-year-old Annalie?
Probably not. Do we have a sense of what Mariah was like, just, as a member of the community? Was it common for her to just sort of help people out like that?
Mariah was just well loved. But I think she also, as many intellectuals do, was not as enthused by the banal things of social life. Her sister would later say that Mariah tried to be coaxed out into social events.
What did they coax her with? Cookies? Science?
She probably would bite for science, to be honest. Her first love was math, and if she could find someone to talk about science and math with, I think that would be her happiest conversations. She has this great quote: "When a man bores me, I think what a pity he couldn't be employed in constructing an artesian well. Counting it at half an hour a day lost to bores, I have lost 17 years, 258 days." This is later in life, of course, but I think she really craved this intellectual conversation, and she really sought out people with whom she could have these intellectual conversations. She surrounded herself by really smart people.
Mariah is known as the Nantucket Athenaeum's first librarian. In that role, did she find that intellectual space that she was craving?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that her work at the Athenaeum was incredibly formative to her adulthood later. She became the librarian, I believe, at 18 years old. And she would stay there for the next 20 years. And she got a meager salary of $60 a year when she started. But the real benefit of it was that it gave her basically unlimited access to knowledge. While at the Athenaeum, she taught herself calculus and higher math, but she also had relations to other people like the Bonds in Boston. And when she got stumped by something she couldn't figure out, she would reach out to the Bonds, who were the director of the Harvard Observatory. And they had this friendly relationship, especially with George Bond, helping each other figure out equations. But it also exposed her to people around her. And not only did she love to learn, but I think she also really loved to teach. And she has these really nice notes in her journal and letters about the people that she helped inspire to learn.
I want to circle back to what you mentioned about her relationship with these people in Boston. How did that impact her career?
They had a huge impact in her career. It's ultimately her connection to academics in Boston, like the Bonds, who I just mentioned, or Edward Everett, who was the president of Harvard, who would be some of her staunchest supporters. And it was these connections that in no small part were the reason that she was awarded the gold medal from the King of Denmark when she discovered her comet.
Okay, so to connect the in-between here, how does she sort of spring to attention for the comet?
So let's back up to how we started this episode. Maria Mitchell has snuck out of the party and is on the roof of the Pacific Bank sweeping the heavens with her telescope when she sees this new nebulous body in the sky. Now, this is something that she's never seen before, and she's more cautious to label it as a new comet than her father was, but ultimately, it was a new comet, and she thought that surely, if anyone had seen it, the Bonds would have seen it. But they record the observation, William Mitchell records it. He writes to Harvard as soon as possible, and that, because we live on an island, that does take 3 days to leave Nantucket. But Edward Everett would eventually write back, confirming that it was the first sighting of this comet in North America, and inquires if they've already applied for the gold medal from the King of Denmark yet.
Do we know why they were awarding the medal?
Yeah, I mean, it was an incentive to try to broaden the scope of science, to try to incentivize people to look out to the stars and find new things in the sky.
How would you prove that you've found a new comet?
Well, you record the observation. That's what William did. And then you have to alert the scientific community. And the best way to do that, alert your friends at Harvard, the Bonds, Edward Everett. And they respond to the Mitchells, confirming that Maria was actually the first one to see the comet in the United States. And they tell the Mitchells about this competition and the gold medal from Denmark. However, the Mitchells technically did not follow the proper procedure to claim the medal.
If they weren't following the correct procedure, did they run into any roadblocks along the way, or?
Oh yeah, it proves a headache to the family. Edward Everett reaches back out to William Mitchell. At this point, Maria is not really in the record. It's mostly the men around her who are communicating, who are advocating for her, right? So that I want to make that clear. But Edward Everett reaches back out to William and he says, "I am fearful that the rigor deemed necessary in enforcing the regulations relative to the King of Denmark's prize may prevent your daughter from receiving it." So he's not optimistic initially that they can have the gold medal awarded. But he does say, and they continue on in this letter, quote, "At any rate, it is worth trying. And if we can do no more, we can establish the lady's claim to all the credit." Meaning that even if they can't get the gold medal, if they go through the process, they can prove that she was the one who first discovered the comet. It would be seen 2 days later, actually, by Father Secchi in the Vatican. And he initially is given credit. But the communication by William Mitchell demonstrates that actually Maria was the first one to see it. And that becomes evident pretty quickly, and Father Secchi would actually concede that. But the question still stands. In the King of Denmark's medal competition, they did not alert the authorities that are described in the competition. So will she still be awarded this gold medal and the acclaim that comes with it? And that is the question that persists for about the next year.
That's a long time.
It is, and William and Maria both pretty quickly concede that they probably will not receive this gold medal. William writes back to Edward Everett, "The stipulations of His Majesty have therefore not been complied with, and the peculiar circumstances of the case, her sex and isolated position, may not be sufficient to justify suspension of the rules. Nevertheless, it would gratify me greatly that the generous monarch should know that there is a love of science even in this remote corner of the earth." And so again, you have this, even if we can't get the gold medal, just knowing that we were actually first matters to them.
It's also interesting that it's not just that they didn't, reach out to the right people, but it's also the peculiar circumstance of where they are and who she is.
Mm-hmm. That actually comes into play quite heavily. Everett actually uses those peculiar circumstances to their full advantage. And as he's communicating with his connections in Europe and being the one who truly advocates for Maria Mitchell, he really leans quite heavily into this, oh, Nantucket's an isolated place. They don't know any better. Oh, the Mitchells had no idea the competition even existed. And as far as I can tell, it is Everett who actually makes them aware of the gold medal competition. But leaning into this, oh, it's Nantucket. They don't know. Oh, it's the United States. We're a young country. We don't know.
I don't think that would get us very far today.
Not so much.
How did this resolve?
The president of Harvard, Edward Everett, really steps in, and he leads a letter-writing campaign to advocate for Maria Mitchell. It becomes pretty evident that she was the first person to see this comet. She was the first human to ever lay eyes on it through her telescope. And when that becomes well known, academics both in America and in Europe get behind her and write to Denmark advocating for her. Eventually, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, a diplomat in Denmark, takes up the cause too. And finally, the King of Denmark concedes. And despite not following procedure exactly, he does award the gold medal to the Nantucketer, Maria Mitchell.
Amazing.
So that's 1848.
How did she get the medal? Did she travel to get it?
Initially, actually, the gold medal was sent to Edward Everett. As he was the one liaising, he takes reception of it from Europe. Mariah misses him by, I think, a day in Boston. She comes back to Nantucket. And he shows it off to everyone who would look at it in Boston. And I think because of that, I don't necessarily think he was advocating for Mariah Mitchell purely from an altruistic or from a friendly point of view. I think that in many ways, he saw it as a way to promote Harvard, promote his own observatory, and promote American scientists writ large. I mean, Mariah Mitchell is the first American astronomer to really be recognized by Europe, the dominant astronomical authority, as discovering a comet. That's no small deal.
So he's showing off the medal. Did Mariah ever get it?
Yes, it was sent over pretty quickly. Eventually, it made its way to Nantucket. And the Mariah Mitchell Association here on Island actually still has that medal, and they bring it out for special occasions.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's a pretty incredible story. And in some ways, though, not to take away from her success, finding a comet is somewhat chance. Mariah Mitchell knew her stars. She's incredibly smart, incredibly intelligent, but you still have to be looking at the right spot at the right time to discover a comet. And this little bit of luck, compounded by all of her skill and knowledge, really launches her into a very successful career as the first female astronomer in the United States. This medal would kickstart her career.
It's pretty amazing that this discovery that she's still known for wasn't even necessarily the pinnacle of her career, but more so the launching point.
I like that. I agree with that completely.
So she finds this comet, and this launches her career here on Nantucket. What else is Mariah Mitchell known for? What does she do with the rest of her career?
After she finds this comet, a year later, well, about 18 months later, she finally receives the gold medal. Almost immediately after that, the accolades come flying in. The same year, she's the first woman ever accepted to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That same year, her job at the Athenaeum is compounded by being approached by the Secretary of the Navy to write for the Nautical Almanac. And so now she's tasked with calculating the movements of Venus to include in this book that helps navigators travel around by using the stars. She gets paid $300 for that.
That's a jump from $60 a year at the Athenaeum.
Well, it's on top of. So between her job at the Athenaeum and her work with the Nautical Almanac, she becomes financially independent. She later worked for the U.S. Coast Survey, which was actually initially established by Thomas Jefferson to map the coast. It's the largest employer of scientists and intellectuals at the time. And with all of this, she doesn't need to marry. She's a woman, but she can live by herself. She has the intellectual ability and job opportunities to exist without needing a husband. And so she ultimately never marries. I think in a large part because if she did, she would have lost a lot of autonomy that allowed her to develop the career that she did.
What did she do after that?
Well, I think her world was broadening. And she also just became increasingly aware of the world around her and the connections that were provided off island. And I think that when Mariah's mother, Lydia, passed away, it was just too much to stay on Nantucket. With everything going on, William and Mariah move off island and move to Lynn, Massachusetts to be close to one of her other sisters.
I know she went on to become a professor at Vassar College, which is one of the Seven Sisters colleges founded for women's education specifically. How did she come to be in that role?
Vassar was an all-women's college. It was founded with the expectation of holding women to the same intellectual caliber as other male liberal arts colleges. So it's providing an actual education, not just a seminary school, but an actual liberal arts education. And of the 8 professors that were hired, 2 of them were women. But the first one ever hired by Vassar was Mariah Mitchell. So her reputation's preceding her. It's only growing year after year. People know her. When she goes to Europe, she brings these very formal letters of introduction, and people almost laugh at her because they know who she is. So her reputation is incredibly high as an astronomer. I think there's a bit of novelty in the fact she's a woman too.
Definitely. I mean, I feel like most women who had really successful professional careers, there was novelty to that at that point.
Yeah, 100%.
But Mariah's dad has come up quite a lot. Can you speak to their relationship at all? And sort of, it sounds like he was really her biggest cheerleader in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, the 2 of them, up until his death, never really parted ways. Like I said before, this whole family was incredibly close. William and Lydia made lots of sacrifices to give all of their 8 children a very high quality education. And people loved William too. And Maria Mitchell learned astronomy by being her father's assistant. Well, her fame far preceded his. And when she moves off island and continues doing her astronomical work in Lynn, they build an observatory. Well, at this point, their roles have completely reversed. Where Mariah has gone from being his assistant, now William Mitchell is Mariah's assistant. And he helps her do these calculations. And so when she goes to Vassar, William follows her. And he continues to be her assistant even at Vassar. As he gets older, Mariah becomes his caretaker. Remember, she's unmarried. And so she takes care of him. They live at Vassar together. Eventually, he will pass away. And actually Mariah would return to Nantucket and are still buried here in Prospect Hill Cemetery.
Taking a little bit of a pivot here, I think sort of the common thread here is that she's, making a lot of firsts as a female scientist, first female professor at Vassar.
One of the first women to work for the federal government.
Yeah. Do we know anything about her relationship to women's rights movements?
Yeah, she, especially later in life, really became a very vocal advocate for the advancement of women. One of her colleagues at Vassar would later write, quote, "However interested you might have been in women's suffrage, and all the other subjects concerning the cause, you felt that in comparison with this grand woman, you hardly knew the alphabet. She judged everything from the standpoint, how is this going to affect women?" And especially during her time at Vassar, she became a very, very vocal advocate for helping women move up in society. A lot of that was through education. She really, like I said before, I think one of her biggest loves was not only learning, but teaching. And she liked being a professor, and people loved her as a professor. But I think she increasingly became aware of the inequality between men and women, especially after she left Nantucket. I mean, that's not to say she didn't face prejudice on Nantucket. She actually turned down jobs working for the Coast Survey before the comet because she thought that the politics of having a woman in the government was too much. Actually, her father thought that, and so she did not work for the government before she could have. But it really became even more evident off island. One example of this is when she's hired in the 1860s to work at Vassar. Her salary as a woman is less than half of her male counterparts. And she's the first one they're approached, right? They really want her, and yet her salary is still half. And so she actually argues with the other woman, professor who was hired, for equal salaries. Something that we still talk about, right, in modern politics. She would go on to chair regional meetings and was a member of the Association for the Advancement of Women. She really took a lot of pride in teaching women specifically, and a lot of her students would go on to really lay the groundwork for a lot of female scientists moving forward. She is an incredible woman with an incredible legacy, and those students did leave as some of the best educated women in the world, educated by one of the best astronomers in the world, Maria Mitchell.
That's the end of our research into Maria Mitchell, the famous Nantucket astronomer and scientific luminary of the early United States. We'll be right back for an interview with Jascin Leonardo Finger from the Maria Mitchell Association. Don't go away.
Welcome back. Annalie and I are joined now by Jascin Leonardo Finger, who's the Maria Mitchell Association's Deputy Director and the Curator of the Mitchell House Archives and Special Collections. So, Jascin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into Maria Mitchell's story, I want to ask a little bit about you. What drew you to Maria Mitchell and her story? Because I believe you started working at the Maria Mitchell Association at about the same age that Maria Mitchell started doing astronomy, right?
Sort of, yes. So I grew up around the Maria Mitchell Association. There weren't really a lot of classes for the things that I was interested in. I mean, I'm into birds and bugs, but when I was, I wasn't so into birds and bugs. And so we would go on walks, nature walks with Clint and Edith Andrews, and go to the museums. And then I was kind of looking for something to do. So my mother said, "Why don't you volunteer at the Mitchell House?" I was 12. And my mom kind of has joked, "I watched you walk in and I never watched you walk out." And so I volunteered for a year or two, starting when I was 12. And Laura Evans was the curator at the time. So I kind of grew up in the Mitchell house, and I was just surrounded by amazing people, amazing women like Laura Evans and Edith Andrews and Susan and Wes Tiffany. I had a unique opportunity, and they really shaped, besides my family, of course, they really shaped who I became as a person. And so I have a hard time unraveling myself from like the MMA and the Mitchell house, because it's become so much a part of who I am. And I think, people are like, what is your specialty? It's like the Mitchell house and the Mitchells. And having been there for so long too, kind of adding maybe the institutional history. So I cannot point out a galaxy of some sort on the telescope to you, but I can talk to you about the history of our astronomy program and our observatories. So it really has been a gift to me in my life as far as being involved with the MMA, and it has always remained the same at its core. There is a heart that beats there, and that's Mariah and the Mitchells, and then all the people who made the Mariah Mitchell Association what it is, based on her legacy, of course, but who built it, and all her cousins who started it, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of, to me, what the MMA is, but also why I'm still there as long as I can be.
So one of the things that I really want to dive into this conversation with you about is exactly that, is Mariah's legacy. You just mentioned that you felt inspired by her legacy in the MMA's mission. If you could kind of quantify her legacy, how would you describe what her impact has been, both at the MMA, but also in American history?
I think I would go at it first from American history, because it was her family members and her students, or former students and friends, who started the Mariah Mitchell Association after she had passed away. But she had a long-reaching, and still has a long-reaching effect, I think, to anyone, particularly women and girls, but anyone in education and the sciences, education in general, because she really helped to pave the way for others. And she was a firm believer in helping others, and a firm believer in always putting her hand back to make sure she was bringing others along with her. Not, I was there, I had to deal with that, now it's your turn to deal with it. It wasn't that. I was there, I dealt with it, and this is how I'm going to help you deal with it and help you take a step beyond me. So I think particularly for any women or girls in STEM, they're all standing on her shoulders. So she's everywhere. I think also for the MMA, her legacy for us is making science and education accessible to all, making it fun. And then Mariah very much believed in learning by doing, which is something she got from her father and Cyrus Pierce.
Her father and Cyrus Pierce know each other, and they were friends.
Yes. And she would be his teaching assistant for at least a year. But that kind of idea of learning by doing is very much a Nantucket thing. And I think it's actually very much a Quaker thing. Quakers were very much lifelong learners. And so that kind of is very much the legacy of the Mariah Mitchell Association. And I think also, when her family members and her former students founded the organization in 1902, they wanted to perpetuate her legacy. They wanted to preserve the Mitchell house that she was born in. So originally everything started in the Mitchell house, because people are like, why do you have an aquarium? Why do you have a natural science museum? Because Mariah was a naturalist. She wasn't just an astronomer and a mathematician. She had a deep love for the natural world. And she gained that from going to Nantucket schools, going to her father's schools. A daily nature walk was a part of William Mitchell's school
I didn't know that.
classroom.
I love that.
Yeah, so he was always taking his students out. And so that was very much a part of her life, walking around and noticing what's blooming, what animals she's seeing. She was a keen observer. An astronomer definitely has to be an observer. They have to be a keen observer to be able to see things in the night sky and pick out, that's not right. What is that? Oh, that's a comet. But they also, just little things that she would notice. And I think that's what makes the Mariah Mitchell Association so special. So we're doing science and research, but we're also making sure that people understand its importance, why it's relevant to them, and also making sure that it's accessible and understandable.
Let's back up. You mentioned, Quakers being a lifelong learner and the influence of her father, but can you set the stage for us in her youth of how influential Nantucket was in her development as eventually a famed astronomer and scientist, how important was the social, economic structures of Nantucket in allowing her to become who she did become?
I think Mariah was still special. I don't want to make it sound like she wasn't special, but I think that she grew up, I know she grew up in a unique situation, both in her home life, but also on Nantucket. So not everyone here was Quaker, but Quakerism from the beginnings of its kind of coming to the island really would influence how life was lived here, whether how buildings or houses were built, how new laws and rules were created, because you have to kind of go back to the late 1600s, early 1700s, and thinking about kind of there wasn't lawlessness here, but there were no real laws. It was very much no, and it was very much about living on a frontier and the whole idea of a corporate family economy. She was growing up going to Quaker meeting once a week and watching women stand up in front of Quaker meeting to speak when they felt called to by God. And that Quaker influence very much impacted her for her entire life. She would leave Quaker meeting in her early 20s, but it very much still kind of ruled her life as far as how she dressed, how she spoke, how she thought, how she looked at the world, her worldview. And so, I think that's a powerful thing when you watch women in a time when women are considered less than men. You watch in a community where women were considered pretty much equal.
This is on Nantucket, you mean?
On Nantucket. It wasn't, not every man was yay, rah, rah, go out there and work, my dear wife. But there was a support system. And so I think that's very powerful. Having grown up where on my mother's side of the family, it was very much women. Most of the men were actually not alive. But also for me, growing up at the Mariah Mitchell Association, where there were so many women who were running all the different departments, that's a powerful thing for a young girl, as it would have been for Mariah. And then to have a father who supports what you're doing and wants you to learn. I think one of her sisters said she never saw their mother really pick up a book and read it when they were children, because I think that Lydia was running a household for 12, but I think she was also taking on more tasks so that her children would be able to get educations. She would inspect books that came into the house because she wanted to see what her children were reading. But I think that education was something that was incredibly important to this family. Mariah only had an education up to the age of 16 because that's all you could have on Nantucket at the time. So that's when she became a teaching assistant. Then at 17, she opened her own school. And then at 18, the world was cast at her feet when she became the first librarian at the Athenaeum, because then she had all those books that she could read. And she would further her education through self-education. So all of her siblings had as good of educations as they could for Nantucket at the time. And they all went on to do phenomenal things in their own right.
I mean, just to put this in context, this is not just, looking back, we see this. Contemporary speakers were saying the same thing. Lecturer and minister Theodore Parker, he came to Nantucket, and afterwards he would write, quote, "I think there is no town in New England where the whole body of women is so well educated." And Nat Philbrick, one of probably the most famous Nantucket historians alive today, he parrots this, and in a chapter about Mariah Mitchell in his book, A Way Offshore, he writes, quote, "There's probably no other town in 19th century America that could have produced a woman of Mariah's remarkable character and abilities." Do you think that's true, that Nantucket did have a uniqueness that allowed Mariah to grow into the astronomer she became?
Yes, because when you think about the influence, especially when you think about the influence of Quakerism here, because there were other pockets of Quakers elsewhere, but it didn't have the same effect for women as it did on Nantucket.
What do you mean by that?
I think because of the isolation of the island, kind of going back to that frontier quality, that Nantucket remained isolated. So on a frontier, this is the kind of theory behind a corporate family economy. Everyone has to work together for survival. So if one part to the machine breaks, the whole machine breaks down. And so everybody realized that they all had to work together. And I think that's another reason why women were supported in what they did, because they were playing a vital role. Because not just Parker, not just Nat Philbrick, but Caroline Dahl in the 19th century wrote a book. The subtitle is The College, the Market, and the Court. But she talks about Nantucket women in this book. and their education and their prowess for work and their ability to work. Phoebe Coffin-Hannaford, who was born and raised as a Quaker on Nantucket, she in her American Daughters talks about women as a whole on Nantucket and then pulls out all these different women, including Mariah, and talking about just the power that these women had. And Phoebe Coffin-Hannaford even talks about the fact that if she had not been raised on Nantucket, if she had not been raised as a Quaker, she probably wouldn't have been able to accomplish the things that she did. Do I think she could have accomplished what she did if she lived elsewhere? Possibly, but she needed multiple things happening to have that happen. She definitely had the support from her family, but if her family wasn't Quakers, maybe not. But yeah, there's so many examples of women taking on roles on whale ships when, of course, only the captain's wife could go to sea, but have to put out that. But taking on roles that women elsewhere probably wouldn't have. On Nantucket, it was perfectly acceptable for women not to remarry and also not to marry. I mean, there's Sarah Barney, who was in the 1700s, who was a Quaker woman who never married, and she traveled for about 50 years, not all in one thing, but off of Nantucket to go to other parts of the U.S. to try and influence Quakerism, to go to Britain.
And of course, a woman traveling by herself was,
considered inappropriate. Yes. Well, Mariah did that quite often.
But Mariah herself never married.
She did not. And I think part of it was that she knew if she married, she would have to give up some part of her work.
When Mariah Mitchell eventually leaves Nantucket, was she leaving to travel for pleasure, for work? What took her off Nantucket?
She did travel a bit. She was very active and one of the founders of the Association for the Advancement of Women and another women's group called Cirrhosis, which means sisterhood. It's not about your liver. And so she traveled for those and the women's congresses and speaking at those. She did do, on occasion, a little bit of speaking. It wasn't her really what she wanted to do. She didn't like lecturing. And then she'd also, in 1857, 1858, travel through the southern United States as a young woman chaperone and then into Europe as well. And that, for her, was the equivalent, as it was for many people in the 19th century, of a college education. But like kind of the big trips would be those four, the two eclipses and then going to Europe. And then she'd actually go back to Europe in 1873 with her sister Phoebe, the artist, her nephew, William Mitchell Kendall, who was an architect, would become an architect with McKim, Mead and White, and her brother-in-law, Joshua Kendall, and they would travel. By the time she did that trip, because she was able to get into the observatory at Pulkovo in Russia, she would then have achieved being able to visit every major observatory in Europe. And of course, when she first went in the 1850s, she went with letters of introduction because that's how everybody had to, yes, exactly. Open sesame, as she literally called it her open sesame. And she was, I think, disappointed that her open sesame was not needed because everybody knew who she was because she had discovered her comet. She was considered America's first woman astronomer. She had received her gold medal. It had been about 10 years and every door and every observatory was thrown open, including the Vatican's, only during the day, though. That took 2 weeks to get in. Somebody suggested she might want to wear pants, which she found horrific. And she was allowed in. No, she did not. She refused, but they did let her in, but only during the day. And as the sun was setting, she was politely ushered out. But she got to meet many of her heroes. Mary Somerville, who was an English scientist who lived in Italy, was one of her heroes. She got to meet her, von Humboldt. Oh, I mean, you name the person of the 19th century between being here in America and being in Europe. She pretty much met everybody and knew everyone and carried on lifelong friendships with them.
I think it's easy when we think about, especially scientists, we think about Newton or Einstein, we tend to think of them as, solo intellectuals who sit in the office and come up with these ways of understanding the world. But I think you have a kind of a similar narrative about Mariah, but she really was connected to very, very well, especially through her father. I mean, the president of Harvard went to bat for her, and you don't always have the president of Harvard on speed dial.
Speed dial. After we mail our letter, that will take 5 days to get there. Yes,
she was well connected.
Yes, no, she was. If it wasn't for Edward Everett, she probably wouldn't have gotten the gold medal because there was a lot of the Americans went about it the wrong way. There was a whole system that you had to go through, and the Americans just did not know it. So they were a remarkable family, I think everybody needs to realize that they weren't, in my family, you call yourself a plugger. So things don't come to you naturally. You're not like, instantly like the intellectual, most intelligent being on the earth. Everything just comes to you like that. You work hard. And Mariah was a plugger. Did she have a brain? Obviously she had a brain. Obviously all of her siblings and her parents had brains, but they worked hard to learn what they knew. It was not just something that they just, I don't have to study for that test. No, they had to study for that test. So she worked hard. And I think that's also important, particularly for me, for younger people to understand that not everything comes easily to everybody. I mean, even like you mentioned Einstein. I mean, Einstein, he didn't talk for the first 3 or 5 years of his life. It's just, so she was, a
hard worker.
Yes. I mean, she was teaching herself Greek, like in the last years of her life.
Wow.
Who teaches themselves Greek? I mean, I know we have apps now that can do that, but she didn't.
Yeah, she's not pulling up Duolingo. She's pulling out the textbooks.
And she's like, who is she going to find who's going to speak Greek to her? Like, I mean, unless you go, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like literally using a book and a pronunciation key and, which beyond my ability. My mom was an English teacher, beyond my ability.
A question I have about her time at the Athenaeum. I know other Athenaeums, I think the Boston one in particular, did not allow women to be members for a long time. Was that during Mariah's lifetime? Do you know? Was it unusual?
I think it would depend on the community. So, but I mean, there were men's clubs on Nantucket. There were places that women weren't allowed to, but there was also women's clubs on Nantucket where men weren't allowed to come. I mean, there was later in the 19th century, Gertrude King and her partner, they started the Goldenrod Literary and Debating Society for girls, so that they could come and read books that maybe they weren't reading at school, and that they could learn how to speak and that they could learn how to debate. And that was something that I thought was lacking in the schools on Nantucket at the time, but it was just for girls.
We talked earlier about Mariah's role as a professor at Vassar, but we didn't really talk about what that was like for her. Do you have a sense of what it was like to step into that role?
Mariah talks about students coming and parents being, saying, make sure she curls her hair. And Mariah's like, really? Give me a break. She didn't say it that way. And she was very polite, but she was just flabbergasted. She was also flabbergasted by, it's not going to sound right, but the lack of education that the young women came with, the fact that some of them had very elementary mathematics. And she had to teach them higher mathematics in order to let them do astronomy because they just didn't know. And it wasn't their fault. It was that girls in other parts of the country just were not taught these things. And Mariah was taken aback by just how limited their educations had been. And women's colleges were new. So people did not want to send their daughters off to school where they had no control over them.
How was she received as a professor?
They wanted Mariah to teach at Vassar because they thought she would attract students, and that people would be more willing to let their daughters go off to school where they had no control of them if America's first woman astronomer was at Vassar College. She was first approached by a trustee who started a letter writing campaign and was telling her about Vassar and basically asking her if she'd be interested in teaching. And Mariah thought he was more asking her what her thought of was for a women's college, like would it do well? And it was William, her father, who was like, Mariah, I think they are telling you that they want you to come teach at Vassar. She's like, oh, no, I can't do that. He's like, what do you mean you can't do that? She's like, I can't do that. I don't have a college education myself. How can I be the future of women scientists and women who are going to go out into America and the world? How can I possibly do that?
I'm kind of fascinated by that mentality and the story about her not wanting to wear pants, because I feel like so often when we grasp onto these historic female figures, it's looking at all the ways that they were breaking the norms and sort of trying to defy convention. And it doesn't seem like she was doing that in the same way.
No, and I think in part, and this is where I put words into her mouth, because she was moving, and this is how I see myself moving through the world. She was moving through the world as a human, as a being, not male, not female, as a being. And therefore, she should be able to do what she wanted to do, and everyone else should be able to do what they wanted to do. Now, I mean, within reason, obviously. And they should be able to just show up in a pub and not have all the men turn around and look at you, which did happen to Mariah. She should be able to just, travel out west with her students to go view a solar eclipse and not create this sensation because there are a bunch of ladies traveling in an open wagon with telescopes. So I think for her, shouldn't be any different.
Well, Mariah's list of accolades is long. It's a lot of firsts, discovering a telescopic comet, one of the first women to ever be employed by the federal government, the first female American astronomer, winning this gold medal from the King of Denmark. She worked with the U.S. Coast Survey, the U.S. Nautical Almanac. She sees a lot of success in her life. But do you think that there was one thing that she was most proud of, that at the end of her life she could look back on and say, I did that?
She said that she was more proud of her medal from the Republic of San Marino for basically, which was like a lifetime achievement, than she was, and I know people find this horrific, for her gold medal for the King of Denmark. Because to use a 21st century term that did not exist in the 19th century, for her it was a one-off. It was, she discovered a comet, boom, done. Not that it wasn't impressive, not that it wasn't something that was a big deal, but the San Marino medal, which we have the gold medal for the King of Denmark, we don't know what happened to the San Marino. It was in her will and passed down in the family. But that was what she had done throughout her life, not just the comet discovery, but her work in astronomy, her work for women in education, women in the sciences, women's rights, because she was also, early proponent of women's rights and very active in all of that. That had more meaning to her. I think if she was to look back at her life and all she had done, I think her work in paving the way for women in sciences and women in education was something that she would have felt incredibly proud about. But still, because of her upbringing, because she was who she was, and because she was raised as a Quaker, she would still be very modest about it. She was not boastful. She always had an opinion, but she wasn't boastful.
Well, it leads me to one of my last questions. It seems that she never really sought out the spotlight. When she won her gold medal, it was in no small part due to the advocacy of those around her, her father, Edward Everett, even the Bonds to a degree. Even when she was approached by Vassar, she didn't think that, as you just said, that she was the one they were reaching out to be a professor. So my question is, as someone who didn't publish an autobiography, as someone who didn't put themselves in the spotlight, how was her legacy preserved? How do we know all this information that we know about her and preserve her influence in her life?
So when she died in 1889, she left all of her papers to her sister Phoebe.
Is the artist?
Yes, the artist, Phoebe Mitchell Kendall. And Phoebe published them into Mariah Mitchell, A Life in Letters and Journals. And Phoebe was very good at editing the papers. She was very good at lining things out, cross-hatching and stuff so you can't read things. Very good at gluing pages together or just outright blading pages out that she thought were inappropriate. Today, we would not think they were inappropriate, but she wanted to protect Mariah's legacy. And then I think, early on after her death in 1889, there were rumblings of wanting to do something to preserve and promote her legacy of what she had accomplished in her life and what she had done for others. And it was, as I said earlier, it was her former students, it was her family members her siblings who still were alive, who are really the founders of the organization. It was her former students and her colleagues. And they wanted to promote that legacy and to perpetuate it and to protect it. And I think they just did an excellent job at doing that. And then in order to kind of protect the house and make sure that it remained and that they grew, they built the observatory in 1908 on Vestal Street. They've built the 1922 astronomical study. They took William Mitchell's schoolhouse that had been the West Introductory School on Vestal Street and then fallen into disrepair. They picked it up, moved it over on the lot, and made that into the library. They were very good at making sure, and they were doing some of this during the Great Depression, of building or acquiring structures to kind of continue to build upon a legacy that already existed, to protect that. And I think that's what also makes the organization unique. It's also one of the oldest, if not the oldest, museums in the country that honors a woman. There's a feeling to the Mariah Mitchell Association that's ageless. So in some respects, we still meet, modern times, but we still have this, like I said earlier, this heart, this core. We still have this 19th century feel to us. I mean, it's not many museums, historic house museums that you walk into that have no electricity, no running water, and have most of the pieces that belong to the family originally and has not been altered. So it has all or a lot of its original decorative paint treatments and things like that. And there are pieces that family members still get back. In 2018, somebody gave us the entire, two sisters, descendants of Mariah's Uncle Peleg, who lived in the house, gave us the entire dinner set that was in the house in the 19th century that Peleg and his wife Mary used, which is really remarkable to be able to show people that this was used. It, hey, maybe Mariah ate off of it too when she came to visit. But the legacy continues. And I think because her legacy is something that we still strive for today, I'm not just talking about the Mariah Mitchell Association, but all people strive for, making sure that we're helping others, that we're helping to educate others, that we're helping to make the pathway for others in science and education. I think that's something that's very important and something that we obviously do, but something that everybody can be a part of, connect with.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge about Mariah Mitchell. And if anyone wants to learn more, they can go to the Mariah Mitchell Association and the Birthplace House. What's the address for that?
So the Mitchell House is located at 1 Vestal Street. We're open seasonally. All of our properties are open Monday through Friday, 10 to 4, Saturdays 10 to 1. And then we have open nights at our Loins Observatory. We have our aquarium downtown. We have tons of programming for families and children and adults. So there's really something for everyone. And we have the birthday coming up on August 1st, which we'll have an open house. So
this will be released on her birthday. So happy birthday, Mariah Mitchell. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.